He got the job. He got the mortgage. He got married, had kids, bought the car he'd been eyeing since his 30s. The Gen X man who did everything right is standing in his kitchen on a Tuesday morning, coffee going cold, looking out at the yard he maintains. And there is this feeling, not grief, not depression exactly, just a flatness where the satisfaction should be. He doesn't know what to call it. So he puts the mug in the dishwasher and goes to work. This isn't a story about failure. It's a story about a particular kind of man who followed every instruction correctly and arrives somewhere he cannot quite name. He is in his late 40s or mid-50s. He is, by every external measure, fine. More than fine. He owns things. He provides for people. He is responsible and dependable and present. And underneath all of that, he carries a quiet, persistent emptiness that he has never mentioned to anyone because he wouldn't know how to begin and because no one in his generation really taught him that you could. This is not a small club. Research from the AARP, published in early 2026, found that Gen X men are among the loneliest demographic in modern Western society, not because they have no people around them, but because the connections they have rarely go deep enough to reach the thing that is actually bothering them. 95% of men surveyed said friendship was essential to a healthy life. A much smaller number had a single friend they talked to about anything real. To understand why he feels this way, you have to understand where he came from. The man in this story was born roughly between 1965 and 1980. He grew up, in many cases, in a house where the adults were busy surviving their own decade, which meant that he learned very young to stop announcing his needs. He let himself in with a key on a string. He made himself a sandwich. He watched television and figured things out and did not make it anyone's problem. By the time he was 12, he had already decided that managing quietly was the same as being strong. Psychology calls this emotional self-containment. The children of that era called it normal. What the research now shows is that this was not simply independence being developed. It was, in many cases, a child learning that his inner life was inconvenient, that the correct response to feeling lost was to appear capable, that asking for help was a kind of burden, and burdens were for other people. This was reinforced at school, at sport, in every social environment that said, in its unspoken way, that the boys who got somewhere were the ones who kept moving, so they kept moving. They got the degree. They pursued the career. They met someone, committed, built something, and spent the next 2 decades maintaining it. Not because they were forced to, because the only map they had said that this was what a good life looked like, and they were determined to follow it correctly. Here is where the psychology gets interesting. Positive psychology researcher Tal Ben-Shahar coined a term for what happens when a person reaches the goal they have been building toward their whole life and feels nothing like what they expected. He called it the arrival fallacy, the belief, so deeply embedded it rarely surfaces as a conscious thought, that once you get to the milestone, the feeling will finally arrive. The house, the stability, the career, the family, the position, all of it carrying the silent promise that someday, when it was assembled, you would feel complete. What the research consistently shows is that the feeling does not arrive, not because the achievements weren't real, not because the life isn't genuinely good, but because the brain's reward circuitry is not designed for arrival. Dopamine, the neurochemical most associated with motivation and reward, is released during the pursuit of a goal. Once the goal is reached, the signal quiets. The brain recalibrates to the new normal and starts scanning for the next thing. This is known as hedonic adaptation, and it is universal, not a character flaw, not ingratitude. It is built in. For most people, this produces mild restlessness. For the Gen X man who did everything right, it can produce something that feels like the ground dissolving under him, because he was not building toward personal meaning. He was building toward completion. And completion, it turns out, is not a feeling. It is an inventory. The Center for Male Psychology describes this kind of man in clinical literature as the successful malcontent, outwardly thriving, internally disconnected. The goals were not consciously chosen from a deep sense of self. They were inherited from family expectations, from cultural pressure, from the slow accumulation of other people's definitions of what a life should look like. And the arrival fallacy delivers a particularly hard landing for men who were never given permission to ask what they actually wanted in the first place. And here is the paradox. The same qualities that made him successful are the ones making him empty. The self-reliance he developed as a latchkey kid meant he never developed the habit of reaching inward to find out what he actually needed. The emotional containment that made him steady under pressure left him almost no infrastructure for examining his own inner life. The competence he built across 4 decades became quietly a cage. Because competence is always doing something, managing something, solving something. And the question underneath the emptiness is not a problem to be managed. He has spent his entire adult life being useful. The research on Gen X men as the so-called sandwich generation puts it in stark terms. Roughly a third of Gen X qualifies as caregivers to both their children and aging parents simultaneously, compared to just 5% of baby boomers at the same life stage. This man is, in many cases, holding up multiple people while nobody is holding him up. And he has trained himself so thoroughly in the art of not needing that he cannot easily identify what being held up would even feel like. The Gen X trait of deep skepticism toward institutions, toward authority, toward anything that smells like being sold something, also makes it very hard for him to seek help. Therapy feels performative to him. Support groups feel like weakness made public. Talking to friends about feelings feels like an imposition. So he handles it. He keeps handling it. He goes to work and mows the lawn and watches the game and handles it. And the emptiness sits quietly below everything, patient and unhurried. What the research actually shows is not particularly dramatic. There is no transformation waiting on the other side of this. There is no insight that resolves it overnight. What the psychological literature on midlife meaning and hedonic adaptation does suggest is a fairly unglamorous set of findings. That the men who find their way through this tend not to find it by doing more, or acquiring more, or reaching the next external marker. They find it by, for the first time, letting their goals come from the inside. That sounds simple. For a man trained since childhood that looking inward is a luxury he never quite earned, it is actually quite confronting. What do you want, outside of what you are supposed to want? What would you pursue if no one was watching and nothing needed to be proven? These questions are not midlife crisis questions. They are just the first real questions some Gen X men have ever been allowed to ask themselves. The AARP study on Gen X male loneliness found that men in this age group hold on to their closest friendships for life, but do not maintain them. The connection exists, but the wire goes quiet. What helps, simply, is making it live again. Not processing sessions or emotional excavation, just a regular conversation that goes one layer deeper than sport and work and the usual deflection. That is all it takes to begin reducing the isolation. It does not require fluency in emotional language that this generation was never taught. It requires showing up consistently with someone who knows you. The Gen X man who did everything right is not broken. He is standing at the end of a very long checklist and noticing, perhaps for the first time, that no one ever asked him to write it. He followed it faithfully. He executed it well, and now he is standing in the quiet of a completed life looking for the part he actually chose. That feeling, the flatness, the vague sense that something essential was left unaccounted for, is not a symptom of failure. It is the first honest signal he has received in decades. The question is not what he missed. The question is what, without the checklist, he might finally be free to find.